This is cycle number 1 for ecosystems and biomes, and we're looking at how energy flows in an ecosystem. And you guys just finished up on a lab that was dealing with how food chains and food webs are different from one another. And so to begin the lab, what you did is you grabbed a note card from the front of the classroom and you grabbed another one. And I asked you to make squares out of those note cards that were all the same size, and that you needed 6 from one of the note cards and 6 from the other one to give you a total of 12 different squares. And the reason why you had to have 12 is because I gave you a list of organisms, and there were 12 different organisms. So on each square you put the name of the organisms. And once you had all of those, you put them face down on your table so you couldn't see the different names, and you mixed them up. And once you had them all mixed up really well, you selected out 6 of them, and from those 6 it was your job to create a food chain from them. Alright, so you had to make a food chain. And you could use the internet to look up different organisms and what they eat. And you created that on a sheet of paper that you would eventually put onto your diagram. After you had your food chain created, you took those 6, the ones that were right here, you took those and you put them back with the other 6, and so now you had 12 of them together. And so from those 12, what you did is you made a food web. And you guys had done a real nice job with that. The biggest concern that I saw was when you had an organism, so let's say we have a mouse and we have a snake. A lot of times what would happen is you guys would put the arrow going to the opposite way of what it should be. So what a lot of people I heard saying was, well, the snake eats the mouse, and so the arrow should be pointed towards the mouse. And actually it's the food chains and food webs. The arrow is representing the way that the energy is flowing. And so the arrow is flowing because the mouse is giving energy to the snake. And so we have to make sure that we do it the correct way. So this is the incorrect way. The correct way is that the arrow represents the way food energy is moving. And so in this case the mouse is giving energy to the snake, so the arrow is pointing towards the snake. Same thing whenever you have grass, it's always going, the arrow is always going to be moving away from the grass, unless we're talking about the sun. If the sun then is giving energy to the grass, which it does, then it would be pointing towards the grass. But otherwise, grass is going to always have an arrow that's coming off of it because of the fact that it is what is known as a producer, and we will talk about that through this section. But that was the lab. After you had finished up with the different food chain and food web diagrams, or the models, you were asked to answer the question of what is the difference between a food chain and a food web. The main difference between a food chain and a food web is the fact that a food web is made up of a bunch of food chains. Usually a food chain is just a single flowing, simple, very easy to follow way of describing how food or energy gets cycled through an area. But when we talk about a food web, what we're actually saying is that a food chain, it's a bunch of food chains that are grouped together. So a good definition for a food chain is the flow of energy. But if we're talking about a food web, what it really means is that it's a bunch of food chains grouped together to show how energy is being moved. The second part of the question asks you, why does the arrow in a food chain point towards the animal that has eaten the food? And that's what we had just talked about. It's because of the fact that it's showing the way that the energy is moving. So the snake is getting the food from the mouse. And so those were the two written explanations that you needed to do. You guys took pictures in class and then sent them to me. But it gave you at least an idea of how the model would work. Now, we're going to look at a little bit about how we would, and here's an example before we get going into the notes. This is an example of a group that had finished up today. You can see that over here they have, over here they have their food chain. So this is their food chain, and you'll notice that it's very simple. All right, they just have the arrows flowing in the correct direction, and then down here, this is where you find the food web, and this one is much more complex. As you can see, that there's arrows that are moving in different directions, and you'll notice that there's nothing flowing to grass because there was no sunshine. And they gave definitions of a food chain and a food web. And so that was an example of a job well done. And so good work on that group. All right, definitions. In the chapter, when you read the first section of the chapter, you're going to notice that it gives us energy flow in an ecosystem. Organisms fill the role of the producer, the consumer, or the decomposer. So basically, there are three parts to every ecosystem. There is going to be a producer, there is going to be a consumer, or there's going to be a decomposer. Specifically looking at a producer is an organism that can make its own food. So examples are plants and algae. And so anything that is able to make its own food usually relies on the sun to be able to give it the energy that it needs, and then it's able to use the process of photosynthesis to create sugars for itself. And once it makes the sugars for itself, it's then able to survive. And things eat that. And the things that would eat that are called consumers. An organism that obtains its energy by feeding on other organisms is called a consumer. Specifically looking at an organism that just eats plants, we refer to that as a herbivore. A herbivore is only going to eat plants. If you're looking at a carnivore is only going to eat animals. And an omnivore is going to be able to eat both plants and animals. And the other definition is a scavenger, which feeds on dead organisms. So we could look at a deer and say that it eats different types of plants, and so that would be an example of a herbivore. We have a picture that is of the bear it's eating a fish over here. That could be an example of a carnivore. And an omnivore we're examples of omnivores. We eat both plants and animals. And scavengers are usually different types of organisms that are feeding on dead organisms. So a lot of times you'll see vultures or crows that will fly down and they will eat those dead organisms. Decomposers break down wastes and dead organisms and return the raw materials to the ecosystem. So decomposers are very, very useful in returning nutrients back into the soil, so that way it helps to grow them. Down on the bottom here I have an example of a food chain, and I have an example of a food web. Again, look at how simplistic the food chain is. It has just very simple plants with one arrow going to an insect going right to a mouse going to an owl. There's no confusion of the owl trying to go here or the owl trying to go over here. It's just a very simple, very easy, this eats this, or I'm sorry, this eats this, this eats this, this eats this. Where if you look at the food web, you'll notice that there are a lot more arrows And what's happening with the arrows is it gets more complex. The frog might eat several things. The coyote might eat several things. And so you have to make sure that you understand that a food web is made up out of several food chains, where a food chain is just a very simplistic way of showing how different organisms fit into their type of environment. So the definition of a food chain is a series of events in which one organism eats another and obtains energy. Again, remember the terms producer and consumer. We say that the first organism is the producer. So over here in this example, the plant would be the producer. Over here in this example, here we have sunlight, but we have grass and algae. Both of those are going to be the producers. The consumer is the next level. Now, there are two different types of consumers. There is a primary consumer and there is a secondary consumer. And so if you're talking about a herbivore, it is going to be a primary consumer because all it's going to be eating is going to be plants. If it is a secondary consumer, it means that it's going to eat the organisms that are, they eat the primary consumers. And so they are taking their energy from an organism that is already eating another organism, which is a plant. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that in class. But basically understand that there's a producer, there's a primary consumer, and there's a secondary consumer. A food web is many overlapping food chains in the ecosystem. And so again, it has all the food chains grouped together in one particular ecosystem. When we're talking about energy and how it flows, you'll often hear us refer to as an energy pyramid. And that shows the amount of energy that moves from one feeding level to another in a food web. So obviously we know that a plant is going to have energy. And when you have a primary consumer that eats the plant, obviously it's going to consume that plant and use a lot of the energy that comes from it. But if you are a secondary consumer and you're eating a primary consumer, you're taking both the energy from the plant and also from the primary consumer. And so there's going to be some energy that is already used up. And so this part down here says that most energy is available at the producer level of the pyramid. As you move up the pyramid, each level has less and less energy than the level below. And so what we're looking at is, imagine that if you have kind of this triangle type deal, and this has the most energy and the top has the least energy. And so what happens is that all of your plants are typically giving most of the energy. And so the next level would be what we would refer to as a primary consumer. Sorry about the handwriting again. I do have a new pad that will be coming that I can use within the next couple of days. This one has been giving me some issues. And then the top level is the secondary consumers. So those ones are going to have the least amount of energy. And so, which makes sense because these are eating the plants, these are eating the primary consumers, and so what's happening is that some of the energy is being used up by the organisms. And so it only makes sense that towards the bottom, where it's getting all of its energy from the sunlight, there would be the most energy, and as you slowly use up the different organisms and let them establish how they are, there's going to be less and less energy. All right, let's look then at the Google Sheet and submit your responses on any questions that you have, and we'll talk to you later.